Section 29 of Why Do We Need a Public Library? This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Why Do We Need a Public Library? By Various. Section 29, The Rights of Man, Response to Burke, Part 1, by Thomas Paine. Rights of Man, Part the First. Being an answer to Mr. Burke's attack on the Revolution. Among the incivilities by which nations or individuals provoke and irritate each other, Mr. Burke's pamphlet on the French Revolution is an extraordinary instance. Neither the people of France nor the National Assembly were troubling themselves about the affairs of England or the English Parliament, and that Mr. Burke should commence an unprovoked attack upon them, both in Parliament and in public, is a conduct that cannot be pardoned on the score of manners, nor justified on that of policy. There is scarcely an epithet of abuse to be found in the English language with which Mr. Burke has not loaded the French nation and the National Assembly. Everything which rancor, prejudice, ignorance, or knowledge could suggest is poured forth in the copious fury of near 400 pages. In the strain and on the plan Mr. Burke was writing, he might have written on to as many thousands. When the tongue or the pen is let loose in a frenzy of passion, it is the man and not the subject that becomes exhausted. Hitherto Mr. Burke has been mistaken and disappointed in the opinions he had formed of the affairs of France, but such is the ingenuity of his hope, or is the malignancy of his despair, that it furnishes him with new pretenses to go on. There was a time when it was impossible to make Mr. Burke believe there would be any revolution in France. His opinion then was that the French had neither spirit to undertake it, nor fortitude to support it. And now that there is one, he seeks an escape by condemning it. Not sufficiently content with abusing the National Assembly, a great part of his work is taken up with abusing Dr. Price, one of the best-hearted men that lives, and the two societies in England known by the name of the Revolution Society and the Society for Constitutional Information. Dr. Price had preached a sermon on the 4th of November, 1789, being the anniversary of what is called in England the Revolution, which took place 1688. Mr. Burke, speaking of this sermon, says, quote, "The political divine proceeds dogmatically to assert that by the principles of the Revolution, the people of England have acquired three fundamental rights. 1. To choose our own governors. 2. To cashier them for misconduct. 3. To frame a government for ourselves." Unquote. Dr. Price does not say that the right to do these things exists in this or in that person, or in this or in that description of persons, but that it exists in the whole, that it is a right resident in the nation. Mr. Burke, on the contrary, denies that such a right exists in the nation, either in whole or in part, or that it exists anywhere. And, what is still more strange and marvelous, he says, quote, "that the people of England utterly disclaim such a right, and that they will resist the practical assertion of it with their lives and fortunes." Unquote. That men should take up arms and spend their lives and fortunes, not to maintain their rights, but to maintain they have not rights, is an entirely new species of discovery, and suited to the paradoxical genius of Mr. Burke. The method which Mr. Burke takes to prove that the people of England have no such rights, and that such rights do not now exist in the nation, either in whole or in part, or anywhere at all, is of the same marvelous and monstrous kind with what he has already said. For his arguments are, that the persons or the generation of persons in whom they did exist are dead, and with them the right is dead also. To prove this, he quotes a declaration made by Parliament about 100 years ago to William and Mary, in these words, quote, "The Lords spiritual and temporal, and Commons, do, in the name of the people aforesaid," meaning the people of England then living, "most humbly and faithfully submit themselves, their heirs and posterities, for ever." Unquote. He quotes a clause of another Act of Parliament made in the same reign, the terms of which he says, quote, "bind us," meaning the people of their day, "our heirs and our posterity to them, their heirs and posterity, to the end of time." Unquote. Mr. Burke conceives his point sufficiently established by producing those clauses, which he enforces by saying that they exclude the right of the nation forever. And not yet content with making such declarations, repeated over and over again, he farther says, that if the people of England possessed such a right before the Revolution, which he acknowledges to have been the case, not only in England, but throughout Europe at an early period, yet that the English nation did, at the time of the Revolution, most solemnly renounce and abdicate it for themselves and for all their posterity forever. As Mr. Burke occasionally applies the poison drawn from his horrid principles, not only to the English nation, but to the French Revolution and the National Assembly, and charges that august, illuminated, and illuminating body of men with the epithet of usurpers, I shall, sans cérémonie, place another system of principles in opposition to his. The English Parliament of 1688 did a certain thing, which, for themselves and their constituents, they had a right to do, and which it appeared right should be done. But, in addition to this right, which they possessed by delegation, they set up another right by assumption, that of binding and controlling posterity to the end of time. The case, therefore, divides itself into two parts, the right which they possessed by delegation, and the right which they set up by assumption. The first is admitted, but with respect to the second, I reply, there never did, there never will, and there never can exist a parliament or any description of men, or any generation of men, in any country, possessed of the right or the power of binding and controlling posterity to the end of time, or of commanding forever how the world shall be governed, or who shall govern it. And therefore all such clauses, acts, or declarations by which the makers of them attempt to do what they have neither the right nor the power to do, nor the power to execute, are in themselves null and void. Every age and generation must be as free to act for itself in all cases as the age and generations which preceded it. The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. Man has no property in man, neither has any generation a property in the generations which are to follow. The Parliament or the people of 1688, or of any other period, had no more right to dispose of the people of the present day, or to bind or to control them in any shape whatever, than the Parliament or the people of the present day have to dispose of, bind, or control those who are to live 100 or 1,000 years hence. Every generation is and must be competent to all the purposes which its occasions require. It is the living, and not the dead, that are to be accommodated. When man ceases to be, his power and his wants cease with him, and having no longer any participation in the concerns of this world, he has no longer any authority in directing who shall be its governors, or how its government shall be organized, or how administered. I am not contending for nor against any form of government, nor for nor against any party, here or elsewhere. That which a whole nation chooses to do it has a right to do. Mr. Burke says no. Where, then, does the right exist? I am contending for the rights of the living, and against their being willed away and controlled and contracted for by the manuscript assumed authority of the dead, and Mr. Burke is contending for the authority of the dead over the rights and freedom of the living. There was a time when kings disposed of their crowns by will upon their deathbeds, and consigned the people, like beasts of the field, to whatever successor they appointed. This is now so exploded as scarcely to be remembered, and so monstrous as hardly to be believed. But the parliamentary clauses upon which Mr. Burke builds his political church are of the same nature. The laws of every country must be analogous to some common principle. In England, no parent or master, nor all the authority of Parliament, omnipotent as it has called itself, can bind or control the personal freedom even of an individual beyond the age of 21 years. On what ground of right, then, could the Parliament of 1688, or any other Parliament, bind all posterity forever? Those who have quitted the world, and those who have not yet arrived at it, are as remote from each other as the utmost stretch of mortal imagination can conceive. What possible obligation, then, can exist between them? What rule or principle can be laid down, that of two nonentities, the one out of existence and the other not in, and who can never meet in this world, the one should control the other to the end of time? In England it is said that money cannot be taken out of the pockets of the people without their consent. But who authorized, or who could authorize, the Parliament of 1688 to control and take away the freedom of posterity, who were not in existence to give or to withhold their consent, and limit and confine their right of acting in certain cases forever? A greater absurdity cannot present itself to the understanding of man than what Mr. Burke offers to his readers. He tells them, and he tells the world to come, that a certain body of men who existed 100 years ago made a law, and that there does not exist in the nation, nor ever will, nor ever can, a power to alter it. Under how many subtleties or absurdities has the divine right to govern been imposed on the credulity of mankind? Mr. Burke has discovered a new one, and he has shortened his journey to Rome by appealing to the power of this infallible Parliament of former days, and he produces what it has done as of divine authority, for that power must certainly be more than human, which no human power to the end of time can alter. But Mr. Burke has done some service, not to his cause, but to his country, by bringing those clauses into public view. They serve to demonstrate how necessary it is at all times to watch against the attempted encroachment of power, and to prevent its running to excess. It is somewhat extraordinary that the offence for which James II. Was expelled, that of setting up power by assumption, should be reacted, under another shape and form, by the Parliament that expelled him. It shows that the rights of man were but imperfectly understood at the Revolution. For certain it is that the right which that Parliament set up by assumption, for by the delegation it had not and could not have it, because none could give it, over the persons and freedom of posterity forever, was of the same tyrannical, unfounded kind which James attempted to set up over the Parliament and the nation, and for which he was expelled. The only difference is, for in principle they differ not, that the one was a usurper over living, the other over the unborn, and as the one has no better authority to stand upon than the other, both of them must be equally null and void and of no effect. From what, or from whence, does Mr. Burke prove the right of any human power to bind posterity forever? He has produced his clauses, but he must produce also his proofs that such a right existed, and show how it existed. If it ever existed, it must now exist, for whatever appertains to the nature of man cannot be annihilated by man. It is the nature of man to die, and he will continue to die as long as he continues to be born. But Mr. Burke has set up a sort of political Adam, in whom all posterity are bound forever. He must therefore prove that his Adam possessed such a power or such a right. The weaker any cord is, the less will it bear to be stretched, and the worse is the policy to stretch it, unless it is intended to break it. Had any one proposed the overthrow of Mr. Burke's positions, he would have proceeded as Mr. Burke has done. He would have magnified the authorities on purpose to have called the right of them into question, and the instant the question of right was started, the authorities must have been given up. It requires but a very small glance of thought to perceive that although laws made in one generation often continue in force through succeeding generations, yet they continue to derive their force from the consent of the living. A law not repealed continues in force, not because it cannot be repealed, but because it is not repealed, and the non-repealing passes for consent. But Mr. Burke's clauses have not even this qualification in their favor. They become null by attempting to become immortal. The nature of them precludes consent. They destroy the right which they might have by grounding it on a right which they cannot have. Immortal power is not a human right, and therefore cannot be a right of Parliament. The Parliament of 1688 might as well have passed an act to have authorized themselves to live forever, as to make their authority live forever. All, therefore, that can be said of those clauses is that they are a formality of words, of as much import as if those who used them had addressed a congratulation to themselves, and in the Oriental style of antiquity had said, "O Parliament, live forever." The circumstances of the world are continually changing, and the opinions of men change also. And as government is for the living, and not for the dead, it is the living only that has any right in it. That which may be thought right and found convenient in one age may be thought wrong and found inconvenient in another. In such cases, who is to decide, the living or the dead? As almost 100 pages of Mr. Burke's book are employed upon these clauses, it will consequently follow that if the clauses themselves, so far as they set up an assumed usurped dominion over posterity forever, are unauthoritative, and in their nature null and void, that all his voluminous inferences and declamation drawn therefrom, or founded thereon, are null and void also, and on this ground I rest the matter. We now come more particularly to the affairs of France. Mr. Burke's book has the appearance of being written as instruction to the French nation. But if I may permit myself the use of an extravagant metaphor, suited to the extravagance of the case, it is darkness attempting to illuminate light. While I am writing this, there are accidentally before me some proposals for a declaration of rights by the Marquis de Lafayette. I ask his pardon for using his former address, and do it only for distinction's sake, to the National Assembly on the 11th of July, 1789, 3 days before the taking of the Bastille, and I cannot but remark with astonishment how opposite the sources are from which that gentleman and Mr. Burke draw their principles. Instead of referring to musty records and mouldy parchments to prove that the rights of the living are lost, "renounced and abdicated forever," by those who are now no more, as Mr. Burke has done, Monsieur de Lafayette applies to the living world and emphatically says, "Call to mind the sentiments which nature has engraved on the heart of every citizen, and which take a new force when they are solemnly recognized by all. For a nation to love liberty, it is sufficient that she knows it, and to be free, it is sufficient that she wills it." How dry, barren, and obscure is the source from which Mr. Burke labors, and how ineffectual, though gay with flowers, are all his declamation and his arguments compared with these clear, concise, and soul-animating sentiments. Few and short as they are, they lead on to a vast field of generous and manly thinking, and do not finish, like Mr. Burke's periods, with music in the ear and nothing in the heart. As I have introduced Monsieur de Lafayette, I will take the liberty of adding an anecdote respecting his farewell address to the Congress of America in 1783, and which occurred fresh to my mind when I saw Mr. Burke's thundering attack on the French Revolution. Monsieur de Lafayette went to America at the early period of the war, and continued a volunteer in her service to the end. His conduct through the whole of that enterprise is one of the most extraordinary that is to be found in the history of a young man scarcely 20 years of age. Situated in a country that was like the lap of sensual pleasure, and with the means of enjoying it, how few are there to be found who would exchange such a scene for the woods and wildernesses of America, and pass the flowery years of youth in unprofitable danger and hardship. But such is the fact. When the war ended, and he was on the point of taking his final departure, he presented himself to Congress, and contemplating in his affectionate farewell the revolution he had seen, expressed himself in these words, "May this great monument raised to liberty serve as a lesson to the oppressor, and an example to the oppressed." When this address came to the hands of Dr. Franklin, who was then in France, he applied to Count Vergennes to have it inserted in the French Gazette, but never could obtain his consent. The fact was that Count Vergennes was an aristocratical despot at home, and dreaded the example of the American Revolution in France, as certain other persons now dread the example of the French Revolution in England, and Mr. Burke's tribute of fear, for in this light his book must be considered, runs parallel with Count Vergennes' refusal. But to return more particularly to his work. "We have seen," says Mr. Burke, "the French rebel against a mild and lawful monarch, with more fury, outrage, and insult than any people has been known to rise against the most illegal usurper, or the most sanguinary tyrant." This is one among 1,000 other instances in which Mr. Burke shows that he is ignorant of the springs and principles of the French Revolution. It was not against Louis XVI, but against the despotic principles of the government that the nation revolted. These principles had not their origin in him, but in the original establishment many centuries back, and they were become too deeply rooted to be removed, and the Augean stables of parasites and plunderers too abominably filthy to be cleansed by anything short of a complete and universal revolution. When it becomes necessary to do anything, the whole heart and soul should go into the measure or not attempt it. That crisis was then arrived, and there remained no choice but to act with determined vigor or not to act at all. The king was known to be the friend of the nation, and this circumstance was favorable to the enterprise. Perhaps no man bred up in the style of an absolute king ever possessed a heart so little disposed to the exercise of that species of power as the present king of France. But the principles of the government itself still remained the same. The monarch and the monarchy were distinct and separate things, and it was against the established despotism of the latter, and not against the person or principles of the former, that the revolt commenced and the revolution has been carried. Mr. Burke does not attend to the distinction between men and principles, and therefore he does not see that a revolt may take place against the despotism of the latter, while there lies no charge of despotism against the former. The natural moderation of Louis XVI contributed nothing to alter the hereditary despotism of the monarchy. All the tyrannies of former reigns acted under that hereditary despotism were still liable to be revived in the hands of a successor. It was not the respite of a reign that would satisfy France, enlightened as she was then become. A casual discontinuance of the practice of despotism is not a discontinuance of its principles. The former depends on the virtue of the individual who is in immediate possession of the power, the latter on the virtue and fortitude of the nation. In the case of Charles I and James II of England, the revolt was against the personal despotism of the men, whereas in France it was against the hereditary despotism of the established government. But men who can consign over the rights of posterity forever on the authority of a mouldy parchment, like Mr. Burke, are not qualified to judge of this revolution. It takes in a field too vast for their views to explore, and proceeds with a mightiness of reason they cannot keep pace with. But there are many points of view in which this revolution may be considered. When despotism has established itself for ages in a country, as in France, it is not in the person of the king only that it resides. It has the appearance of being so in show and in nominal authority, but it is not so in practice and in fact. It has its standard everywhere. Every office and department has its despotism founded upon custom and usage. Every place has its Bastille, and every Bastille its despot. The original hereditary despotism resident in the person of the king divides and subdivides itself into 1,000 shapes and forms, till at last the whole of it is acted by deputation. This was the case in France, and against this species of despotism, proceeding on through an endless labyrinth of office, till the source of it is scarcely perceptible, there is no mode of redress. It strengthens itself by assuming the appearance of duty, and tyrannizes under the pretense of obeying. When a man reflects on the condition which France was in from the nature of her government, he will see other causes for revolt than those which immediately connect themselves with the person or character of Louis XVI. There were, if I may so express it, 1,000 despotisms to be reformed in France, which had grown up under the hereditary despotism of the monarchy, and became so rooted as to be in a great measure independent of it. Between the monarchy, the parliament, and the church there was a rivalship of despotism. Besides the feudal despotism operating locally, and the ministerial despotism operating everywhere. But Mr. Burke, by considering the king as the only possible object of a revolt, speaks as if France was a village, to which everything that passed must be known to its commanding officer, and no oppression could be acted but what he could immediately control. Mr. Burke might have been in the Bastille his whole life as well as under Louis XVI, as Louis XIV, and neither the one nor the other have known that such a man as Burke existed. The despotic principles of the government were the same in both reigns, though the dispositions of the men were as remote as tyranny and benevolence. What Mr. Burke considers as a reproach to the French Revolution, that of bringing it forward under a reign more mild than the preceding ones, is one of its highest honors. The revolutions that have taken place in other European countries have been excited by personal hatred. The rage was against the man, and he became the victim. But in the instance of France we see a revolution generated in the rational contemplation of the rights of man, and distinguishing from the beginning between persons and principles. But Mr. Burke appears to have no idea of principles when he is contemplating governments. "10 years ago," says he, "I could have felicitated France on our having a government, without inquiring what the nature of that government was, or how it was administered." Is this the language of a rational man? Is it the language of a heart feeling as it ought to feel for the rights and happiness of the human race? On this ground Mr. Burke must compliment all the governments in the world, while the victims who suffer under them, whether sold into slavery or tortured out of existence, are wholly forgotten. It is power and not principles that Mr. Burke venerates, and under this abominable depravity he is disqualified to judge between them. Thus much for his opinion as to the occasions of the French Revolution. I now proceed to other considerations. I know a place in America called Point No Point, because as you proceed along the shore, gay and flowery as Mr. Burke's language, it continually recedes and presents itself at a distance before you, but when you have got as far as you can go, there's no point at all. Just thus it is with Mr. Burke's 366 pages. It is therefore difficult to reply to him. But as the points he wishes to establish may be inferred from what he abuses, it is in his paradoxes that we must look for his arguments. As to the tragic paintings by which Mr. Burke has outraged his own imagination, and seeks to work upon that of his readers, they are very well calculated for theatrical representation, where facts are manufactured for the sake of show, and accommodated to produce, through the weakness of sympathy, a weeping effect. But Mr. Burke should recollect that he is writing history, and not plays, and that his readers will expect truth, and not the spouting rant of high-toned exclamation. When we see a man dramatically lamenting in a publication intended to be believed that "the age of chivalry is gone, that the glory of Europe is extinguished forever, that the unbought grace of life, if any one knows what it is, the cheap defense of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment, and heroic enterprise is gone," and all this because the Quixote age of chivalry nonsense is gone, what opinion can we form of his judgment, or what regard can we pay to his facts? In the rhapsody of his imagination he has discovered a world of windmills, and his sorrows are that there are no Quixotes to attack them. But if the age of aristocracy, like that of chivalry, should fall, and they had originally some connection, Mr. Burke, the trumpeter of order, may continue his parody to the end and finish with exclaiming, "Othello's occupation gone!" Notwithstanding Mr. Burke's horrid paintings, when the French Revolution is compared with the revolutions of other countries, the astonishment will be that it is marked with so few sacrifices. But this astonishment will cease when we reflect that principles and not persons were the meditated objects of destruction. The mind of the nation was acted upon by a higher stimulus than what the consideration of persons could inspire, and sought a higher conquest than could be produced by the downfall of an enemy. Among the few who fell, there do not appear to be any that were intentionally singled out. They all of them had their fate in the circumstances of the moment, and were not pursued with that long, cold-blooded, unabated revenge which pursued the unfortunate Scotch in the affair of 1745. Through the whole of Mr. Burke's book I do not observe that the Bastille is mentioned more than once, and that with a kind of implication as if he were sorry it was pulled down and wished it were built up again. "We have rebuilt Newgate," says he, "and tenanted the mansion, and we have prisons almost as strong as the Bastille for those who dare to libel the queens of France." Footnote: Since writing the above, 2 other places occur in Mr. Burke's pamphlet in which the name of the Bastille is mentioned, but in the same manner. In the one he introduces it in a sort of obscure question, and asks, "Will any ministers who now serve such a king, with but a decent appearance of respect, cordially obey the orders of those whom but the other day, in his name, they had committed to the Bastille?" In the other the taking of it is mentioned as implying criminality in the French guards, who assisted in demolishing it. "They have not," says he, "forgot the taking the king's castles at Paris." This is Mr. Burke, who pretends to write on constitutional freedom. As to what a madman like the person called Lord George Gordon might say, and to whom Newgate is rather a bedlam than a prison, it is unworthy of rational consideration. It was a madman that libelled, and that is sufficient apology, and it afforded an opportunity for confining him, which was the thing that was wished for. But certain it is that Mr. Burke, who does not call himself a madman, whatever other people may do, has libelled in the most unprovoked manner, and in the grossest style of the most vulgar abuse, the whole representative authority of France, and yet Mr. Burke takes his seat in the British House of Commons. From his violence and his grief, his silence on some points and his excess on others, it is difficult not to believe that Mr. Burke is sorry, extremely sorry, that arbitrary power, the power of the Pope and the Bastille, are pulled down. Not one glance of compassion, not one commiserating reflection that I can find throughout his book, has he bestowed on those who lingered out the most wretched of lives, a life without hope, in the most miserable of prisons. It is painful to behold a man employing his talents to corrupt himself. Nature has been kinder to Mr. Burke than he is to her. He is not affected by the reality of distress touching his heart, but by the showy resemblance of it striking his imagination. He pities the plumage, but forgets the dying bird. Accustomed to kiss the aristocratical hand that hath purloined him from himself, he degenerates into a composition of art, and the genuine soul of nature forsakes him. His hero or his heroine must be a tragedy victim, expiring in show, and not the real prisoner of misery, sliding into death in the silence of a dungeon. As Mr. Burke has passed over the whole transaction of the Bastille, and his silence is nothing in his favour, and has entertained his readers with reflections on supposed facts distorted into real falsehoods, I will give, since he has not, some account of the circumstances which preceded that transaction. They will serve to show that less mischief could scarcely have accompanied such an event when considered with the treacherous and hostile aggravations of the enemies of the Revolution. The mind can hardly picture to itself a more tremendous scene than what the city of Paris exhibited at the time of taking the Bastille, and for 2 days before and after, nor perceive the possibility of its quieting so soon. At a distance this transaction has appeared only as an act of heroism standing on itself, and the close political connection it had with the Revolution is lost in the brilliancy of the achievement. But we are to consider it as the strength of the parties brought man to man, and contending for the issue. The Bastille was to be either the prize or the prison of the assailants. The downfall of it included the idea of the downfall of despotism, and this compounded image was become as figuratively united as Bunyan's Doubting Castle and Giant Despair. The National Assembly, before and at the time of taking the Bastille, was sitting at Versailles, 12 miles distant from Paris. About a week before the rising of the partisans and their taking the Bastille, it was discovered that a plot was forming, at the head of which was the Count d'Artois, the king's youngest brother, for demolishing the National Assembly, seizing its members, and thereby crushing by a coup de main all hopes and prospects of forming a free government. For the sake of humanity, as well as freedom, it is well this plan did not succeed. Examples are not wanting to show how dreadfully vindictive and cruel are all old governments when they are successful against what they call a revolt. This plan must have been some time in contemplation, because in order to carry it into execution, it was necessary to collect a large military force round Paris, and cut off the communication between that city and the National Assembly at Versailles. The troops destined for this service were chiefly the foreign troops in the pay of France, and who, for this particular purpose, were drawn from the distant provinces, where they were then stationed. When they were collected to the amount of between 25,000 and 30,000, it was judged time to put the plan into execution. The ministry who were then in office, and who were friendly to the Revolution, were instantly dismissed, and a new ministry formed of those who had concerted the project, among whom was Count de Broglio, and to his share was given the command of those troops. The character of this man, as described to me in a letter which I communicated to Mr. Burke before he began to write his book, and from an authority which Mr. Burke well knows was good, was that of "high-flying aristocrat," cool and capable of every mischief." Unquote. While these matters were agitating, the National Assembly stood in the most perilous and critical situation that a body of men can be supposed to act in. They were the devoted victims, and they knew it. They had the hearts and wishes of their country on their side, but military authority they had none. The guards of Broglio surrounded the hall where the assembly sat, ready at the word of command to seize their persons, as had been done the year before to the Parliament of Paris. Had the National Assembly deserted their trust, or had they exhibited signs of weakness or fear, their enemies had been encouraged and their country depressed. When the situation they stood in, the cause they were engaged in, and the crisis then ready to burst, which should determine their personal and political fate and that of their country, and probably of Europe, are taken into one view, none but a heart callous with prejudice or corrupted by dependence can avoid interesting itself in their success. The Archbishop of Vienne was at this time President of the National Assembly, a person too old to undergo the scene that a few days or few hours might bring forth. A man of more activity and bolder fortitude was necessary, and the National Assembly chose, under the form of a Vice President, for the presidency still resided in the Archbishop, M. de Lafayette, and this is the only instance of a Vice President being chosen. It was at the moment that this storm was pending, July 11th, that a Declaration of Rights was brought forward by M. de Lafayette, and is the same which is alluded to earlier. It was hastily drawn up, and makes only a part of the more extensive Declaration of Rights agreed upon and adopted afterwards by the National Assembly. The particular reason for bringing it forward at this moment, M. de Lafayette has since informed me, was that if the National Assembly should fall in the threatened destruction that then surrounded it, some trace of its principles might have the chance of surviving the wreck. Everything now was drawing to a crisis. The event was freedom or slavery. On one side an army of nearly 30,000 men, on the other an unarmed body of citizens, for the citizens of Paris, on whom the National Assembly must then immediately depend, were as unarmed and as undisciplined as the citizens of London are now. The French guards had given strong symptoms of their being attached to the national cause, but their numbers were small, not a tenth part of the force that Broglio commanded, and their officers were in the interest of Broglio. Matters being now ripe for execution, the new ministry made their appearance in officer. The reader will carry in his mind that the Bastille was taken the 14th July. The point of time I am now speaking of is the 12th. Immediately on the news of the change of ministry reaching Paris in the afternoon, all the playhouses and places of entertainment, shops and houses were shut up. The change of ministry was considered as the prelude of hostilities, and the opinion was rightly founded. The foreign troops began to advance towards the city. The Prince de Lambesc, who commanded a body of German cavalry, approached by the Place of Louis XIV, which connects itself with some of the streets. In his march he insulted and struck an old man with a sword. The French are remarkable for their respect to old age, and the insolence with which it appeared to be done, uniting with the general fermentation they were in, produced a powerful effect, and a cry of to arms, spread itself in a moment over the city. Arms they had none, nor scarcely any one who knew the use of them. But desperate resolution, when every hope is at stake, supplies for a while the want of arms. Near where the Prince de Lambesc was drawn up were large piles of stones collected for building the new bridge, and with these the people attacked the cavalry. A party of French guards, upon hearing the firing, rushed from their quarters and joined the people, and night coming on, the cavalry retreated. The streets of Paris, being narrow, are favorable for defense, and the loftiness of the houses, consisting of many stories, from which great annoyance might be given, secured them against nocturnal enterprises, and the night was spent in providing themselves with every sort of weapon they could make or procure: guns, swords, blacksmiths' hammers, carpenters' axes, iron crows, pikes, halberts, pitchforks, spits, clubs, etc., etc. The incredible numbers in which they assembled the next morning, and the still more incredible resolution they exhibited, embarrassed and astonished their enemies. Little did the new ministry expect such a salute. Accustomed to slavery themselves, they had no idea that liberty was capable of such inspiration, or that a body of unarmed citizens would dare to face the military force of 30,000 men. every moment of this day was employed in collecting arms, concerting plans, and arranging themselves into the best order which such an instantaneous movement could afford. Broglio continued lying round the city, but made no further advances this day, and the succeeding night passed with as much tranquillity as such a scene could possibly produce. But defence only was not the object of the citizens. They had a cause at stake, on which depended their freedom or their slavery. They every moment expected an attack, or to hear of one made on the National Assembly, and in such a situation the most prompt measures are sometimes the best. The object that now presented itself was the Bastille, and the éclat of carrying such a fortress in the face of such an army could not fail to strike terror into the new ministry, who had scarcely yet had time to meet. By some intercepted correspondence this morning, it was discovered that the mayor of Paris, Monsieur de Flesselles, who appeared to be in the interest of the citizens, was betraying them, and from this discovery there remained no doubt that Broglio would reinforce the Bastille the ensuing evening. It was therefore necessary to attack it that day, but before this could be done it was first necessary to procure a better supply of arms than they were then possessed of. There was adjoining to the city a large magazine of arms deposited at the Hospital of the Invalids, which the citizens summoned to surrender, and as the place was neither defensible nor attempted much defence, they soon succeeded. Thus supplied, they marched to attack the Bastille, a vast mixed multitude, of all ages and of all degrees, armed with all sorts of weapons. Imagination would fail in describing to itself the appearance of such a procession, and of the anxiety of the events which a few hours or a few minutes might produce. What plans the ministry were forming were as unknown to the people within the city as what the citizens were doing was unknown to the ministry, and what movements Broglio might make for the support or relief of the place were to the citizens equally as unknown. All was mystery and hazard. The Bastille was attacked with an enthusiasm of heroism, such only as the highest animation of liberty could inspire, and carried in the space of a few hours, is an event which the world is fully possessed of. I am not undertaking the detail of the attack, but bringing into view the conspiracy against the nation which provoked it, and which fell with the Bastille. The prison to which the new ministry were dooming the National Assembly, in addition to its being the high altar and castle of despotism, became the proper object to begin with. This enterprise broke up the new ministry, who began now to fly from the ruin they had prepared for others. The troops of Broglio dispersed, and himself fled also. Mr. Burke has spoken a great deal about plots, but he has never once spoken of this plot against the National Assembly and the liberties of the nation, and that he might not, he has passed over all the circumstances that might throw it in his way. The exiles who have fled from France, whose case he so much interests himself in, and from whom he has had his lesson, fled in consequence of the miscarriage of this plot. No plot was formed against them. They were plotting against others, and those who fell met, not unjustly, the punishment they were preparing to execute. But will Mr. Burke say that if this plot, contrived with the subtlety of an ambuscade, had succeeded, the successful party would have restrained their wrath so soon? Let the history of all government answer the question. Whom has the National Assembly brought to the scaffold? None. They were themselves the devoted victims of this plot, and they have not retaliated. Why, then, are they charged with revenge they have not acted? In the tremendous breaking forth of a whole people, in which all degrees, tempers, and characters are confounded, delivering themselves by a miracle of exertion from the destruction meditated against them, is it to be expected that nothing will happen? When men are sore with the sense of oppressions, and menaced with the prospects of new ones, is the calmness of philosophy or the palsy of insensibility to be looked for? Mr. Burke exclaims against outrage, yet the greatest is that which himself has committed. His book is a volume of outrage, not apologized for by the impulse of a moment, but cherished through a space of 10 months, yet Mr. Burke had no provocation, no life, no interest at stake. More of the citizens fell in this struggle than of their opponents, but 4 or 5 persons were seized by the populace and instantly put to death: the governor of the Bastille, and the mayor of Paris, who was detected in the act of betraying them, and afterwards Foulon, one of the new ministry, and Berthier, his son-in-law, who had accepted the office of Intendant of Paris. Their heads were stuck upon spikes and carried about the city. And it is upon this mode of punishment that Mr. Burke builds a great part of his tragic scene. Let us therefore examine how men came by the idea of punishing in this manner. They learn it from the governments they live under, and retaliate the punishments they have been accustomed to behold. The heads stuck upon spikes, which remained for years upon Temple Bar, differed nothing in the horror of the scene from those carried about upon spikes at Paris, yet this was done by the English government. It may perhaps be said that it signifies nothing to a man what is done to him after he is dead, but it signifies much to the living. It either tortures their feelings or hardens their hearts, and in either case it instructs them how to punish when power falls into their hands. Lay, then, the axe to the root, and teach governments humanity. It is their sanguinary punishments which corrupt mankind. In England the punishment in certain cases is by hanging, drawing, and quartering. The heart of the sufferer is cut out and held up to the view of the populace. In France, under the former government, the punishments were not less barbarous. Who does not remember the execution of Damien, torn to pieces by horses? The effect of those cruel spectacles exhibited to the populace is to destroy tenderness or excite revenge, and by the base and false idea of governing men by terror instead of reason, they become precedents. It is over the lowest class of mankind that government by terror is intended to operate, and it is on them that it operates to the worst effect. They have sense enough to feel they are the objects aimed at, and they inflict in their turn the examples of terror they have been instructed to practice. There is in all European countries a large class of people of that description which in England is called the mob. Of this class were those who committed the burnings and devastations in London in 1780, and of this class were those who carried the heads on iron spikes in Paris. Foulon and Berthier were taken up in the country and sent to Paris to undergo their examination at the Hôtel de Ville. For the National Assembly, immediately on the new ministry coming into office, passed a decree, which they communicated to the King and Cabinet, that they, the National Assembly, would hold the ministry, of which Foulon was one, responsible for the measures they were advising and pursuing. But the mob, incensed at the appearance of Foulon and Berthier, tore them from their conductors before they were carried to the Hôtel de Ville, and executed them on the spot. Why then does Mr. Burke charge outrages of this kind on a whole people? As well may he charge the riots and outrages of 1780 on all the people of London, or those in Ireland on all his countrymen. But everything we see or hear offensive to our feelings and derogatory to the human character should lead to other reflections than those of reproach. Even the beings who commit them have some claim to our consideration. How then is it that such vast classes of mankind as are distinguished by the appellation of the vulgar or the ignorant mob are so numerous in all old countries? The instant we ask ourselves the question, reflection feels an answer. They rise as an unavoidable consequence out of the ill construction of all old governments in Europe, England included with the rest. It is by distortedly exalting some men that others are distortedly debased, till the whole is out of nature. A vast mass of mankind are degradedly thrown into the background of the human picture, to bring forward with greater glare the puppet show of state and aristocracy. In the commencement of a revolution, those men are rather the followers of the camp than of the standard of liberty, and have yet to be instructed how to reverence it. I give to Mr. Burke all his theatrical exaggerations for facts, and I then ask him if they do not establish the certainty of what I here lay down. Admitting them to be true, they show the necessity of the French Revolution as much as any one thing he could have asserted. These outrages were not the effect of the principles of the Revolution, but of the degraded mind that existed before the Revolution, and which the Revolution is calculated to reform. Place them then to their proper cause, and take the reproach of them to your own side. It is the honor of the National Assembly and the city of Paris that during such a tremendous scene of arms and confusion, beyond the control of all authority, they have been able by the influence of example and exhortation to restrain so much. Never were more pains taken to instruct and enlighten mankind, and to make them see that their interest consisted in their virtue, and not in their revenge, than have been displayed in the Revolution of France. I now proceed to make some remarks on Mr. Burke's account of the expedition to Versailles, October the 5th and 6th. I can consider Mr. Burke's book in scarcely any other light than a dramatic performance, and he must, I think, have considered it in the same light himself, by the poetical liberties he has taken of omitting some facts, distorting others, and making the whole machinery bend to produce a stage effect. Of this kind is his account of the expedition to Versailles. He begins this account by omitting the only facts which as causes are known to be true. Everything beyond these is conjecture, even in Paris, and he then works up a tale accommodated to his own passions and prejudices. It is to be observed throughout Mr. Burke's book that he never speaks of plots against the Revolution, and it is from those plots that all the mischiefs have arisen. It suits his purpose to exhibit the consequences without their causes. It is one of the arts of the drama to do so. If the crimes of men were exhibited with their sufferings, stage effect would sometimes be lost, and the audience would be inclined to approve where it was intended they should commiserate. After all the investigations that have been made into this intricate affair, the expedition to Versailles, it still remains enveloped in all that kind of mystery which ever accompanies events produced more from a concurrence of awkward circumstances than from fixed design. While the characters of men are forming, as is always the case in revolutions, there is a reciprocal suspicion, and a disposition to misinterpret each other, and even parties directly opposite in principle will sometimes concur in pushing forward the same movement with very different views, and with the hopes of its producing very different consequences. A great deal of this may be discovered in this embarrassed affair, and yet the issue of the whole was what nobody had in view. The only things certainly known are that considerable uneasiness was at this time excited at Paris by the delay of the king in not sanctioning and forwarding the decrees of the National Assembly, particularly that of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the decrees of the 4th of August, which contained the foundation principles on which the Constitution was to be erected. The kindest and perhaps the fairest conjecture upon this matter is, that some of the ministers intended to make remarks and observations upon certain parts of them before they were finally sanctioned and sent to the provinces. But be this as it may, the enemies of the Revolution derived hope from the delay, and the friends of the Revolution uneasiness. During this state of suspense, the Garde du Corps, which was composed, as such regiments generally are, of persons much connected with the court, gave an entertainment at Versailles October 1st to some foreign regiments then arrived, and when the entertainment was at the height, on a signal given, the Garde du Corps tore the national cockade from their hats, trampled it underfoot, and replaced it with a counter cockade prepared for the purpose. An indignity of this kind amounted to defiance. It was like declaring war, and if men will give challenges they must expect consequences. But all this Mr. Burke has carefully kept out of sight. He begins his account by saying, quote, "History will record that on the morning of the 6th October, 1789, the King and Queen of France, after a day of confusion, alarm, dismay, and slaughter, lay down under the pledged security of public faith to indulge nature in a few hours of respite and troubled melancholy repose." Unquote. This is neither the sober style of history nor the intention of it. It leaves everything to be guessed at and mistaken. One would at least think there had been a battle, and a battle there probably would have been had it not been for the moderating prudence of those whom Mr. Burke involves in his censures. By his keeping the Garde du Corps out of sight, Mr. Burke has afforded himself the dramatic license of putting the King and Queen in their places as if the object of the expedition was against them. But to return to my account, this conduct of the Garde du Corps, as might well be expected, alarmed and enraged the partisans. The colors of the cause, and the cause itself, were become too united to mistake the intention of the insult, and the partisans were determined to call the Garde du Corps to an account. There was certainly nothing of the cowardice of assassination in marching in the face of the day to demand satisfaction, if such a phrase may be used, of a body of armed men who had voluntarily given defiance. But the circumstance which serves to throw this affair into embarrassment is, that the enemies of the Revolution appeared to have encouraged it as well as its friends. The one hoped to prevent a civil war by checking it in time, and the other to make one. The hopes of those opposed to the Revolution rested in making the king of their party, and getting him from Versailles to Metz, where they expected to collect a force and set up a standard. We have, therefore, two different objects presenting themselves at the same time and to be accomplished by the same means, the one to chastise the garde du corps, which was the object of the partisans, the other to render the confusion of such a scene an inducement to the king to set off for Metz. On the 5th of October, a very numerous body of women, and men in the disguise of women, collected around the Hôtel de Ville, or Town Hall, at Paris, and set off for Versailles. Their professed object was the garde du corps, but prudent men readily recollect that mischief is more easily begun than ended, and this impressed itself with the more force from the suspicions already stated, and the irregularity of such a cavalcade. As soon, therefore, as a sufficient force could be collected, M. de Lafayette, by orders from the civil authority of Paris, set off after them at the head of 20,000 of the Paris militia. The Revolution could derive no benefit from confusion, and its opposers might. By an amiable and spirited manner of address he had hitherto been fortunate in calming disquietudes, and in this he was extraordinarily successful. To frustrate, therefore, the hopes of those who might seek to improve this scene into a sort of justifiable necessity for the king's quitting Versailles and withdrawing to Metz, and to prevent at the same time the consequences that might ensue between the garde du corps and this phalanx of men and women, he forwarded expresses to the king that he was on his march to Versailles by orders of the civil authority of Paris, for the purpose of peace and protection, expressing at the same time the necessity of restraining the garde du corps from firing upon the people. Footnote: I am warranted in asserting this, as I had it personally from M. de Lafayette, with whom I lived in habits of friendship for 14 years. End of footnote. He arrived at Versailles between 10 and 11 at night. The garde du corps was drawn up, and the people had arrived some time before, but everything had remained suspended. Wisdom and policy now consisted in changing a scene of danger into a happy event. M. de Lafayette became the mediator between the enraged parties, and the king, to remove the uneasiness which had arisen from the delay already stated, sent for the President of the National Assembly, and signed the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and such other parts of the Constitution as were in readiness. It was now about 1 in the morning. Everything appeared to be composed, and a general congratulation took place. By the beat of a drum a proclamation was made that the citizens of Versailles would give the hospitality of their houses to their fellow citizens of Paris. Those who could not be accommodated in this manner remained in the streets, or took up their quarters in the churches, and at 2 o'clock the king and queen retired. In this state matters passed till the break of day, when a fresh disturbance arose from the censurable conduct of some of both parties, for such characters there will be in all such scenes. One of the garde du corps appeared at one of the windows of the palace, and the people who had remained during the night in the streets accosted him with reviling and provocative language. Instead of retiring, as in such a case prudence would have dictated, he presented his musket, fired, and killed one of the Paris militia. The peace being thus broken, the people rushed into the palace in quest of the offender. They attacked the quarters of the garde du corps within the palace, and pursued them through the avenues of it, and to the apartments of the king. On this tumult, not the queen only, as Mr. Burke has represented it, but every person in the palace was awakened and alarmed, and M. de Lafayette had a second time to interpose between the parties, the event of which was that the garde du corps put on the national cockade, and the matter ended as by oblivion, after the loss of 2 or 3 lives. During the latter part of the time in which this confusion was acting, the king and queen were in public at the balcony, and neither of them concealed for safety's sake, as Mr. Burke insinuates. Matters being thus appeased and tranquillity restored, a general acclamation broke forth of "Le Roi à Paris, Le Roi à Paris, the King to Paris." It was the shout of peace, and immediately accepted on the part of the king. By this measure, all future projects of trepanning the king to Metz and setting up the standard of opposition to the Constitution were prevented and the suspicions extinguished. The king and his family reached Paris in the evening, and were congratulated on their arrival by Monsieur Bailly, the mayor of Paris, in the name of the citizens. Mr. Burke, who throughout his book confounds things, persons, and principles, as in his remarks on Monsieur Bailly's address, confounded time also. He censures Monsieur Bailly for calling it un bon jour, a good day. Mr. Burke should have informed himself that this scene took up the space of 2 days, the day on which it began with every appearance of danger and mischief, and the day on which it terminated without the mischiefs it threatened, and that it is to this peaceful termination that M. Belly alludes, and to the arrival of the king at Paris. Not less than 300,000 persons arranged themselves in the procession from Versailles to Paris, and not an act of molestation was committed during the whole march. Mr. Burke, on the authority of M. Lally Tollendal, a deserter from the National Assembly, says that on entering Paris the people shouted "Tous les évêques à la lanterne," all bishops to be hanged at the lanthorn or lampposts. It is surprising that nobody could hear this but Lally Tollendal, and that nobody should believe it but Mr. Burke. It has not the least connection with any part of the transaction, and is totally foreign to every circumstance of it. The bishops had never been introduced before into any scene of Mr. Burke's drama. Why are they all at once and all together, tout à coup et tout ensemble, introduced now? Mr. Burke brings forward his bishops and his lanthorn-like figures in a magic lanthorn, and raises his scenes by contrast instead of connection. But it serves to show, with the rest of his book, what little credit ought to be given, where even probability is set at defiance, for the purpose of defaming. And with this reflection, instead of a soliloquy in praise of chivalry as Mr. Burke has done, I close the account of the expedition to Versailles. Footnote: an account of the expedition to Versailles may be seen in No. 13 of the Révolution de Paris, containing the events from the 3rd to the 10th of October, 1789. End of footnote. End of section 29. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Section 30 of Why Do We Need a Public Library? This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Why Do We Need a Public Library? By Various. Section 30. The Rights of Man. Response to Burke. Part 2. By Thomas Paine. I have now to follow Mr. Burke through a pathless wilderness of rhapsodies, and a sort of descant upon governments, in which he asserts whatever he pleases, on the presumption of its being believed, without offering either evidence or reasons for so doing. Before anything can be reasoned upon to a conclusion, certain facts, principles, or data to reason from must be established, admitted, or denied. Mr. Burke, with his usual outrage, abused the Declaration of the Rights of Man, published by the National Assembly of France, as the basis on which the Constitution of France is built. This he calls, quote, "paltry and blurred sheets of paper about the rights of man." Unquote. Does Mr. Burke mean to deny that man has any rights? If he does, then he must mean that there are no such things as rights anywhere, and that he has none himself, for who is there in the world but man? But if Mr. Burke means to admit that man has rights, the question then will be, what are those rights, and how man came by them originally? The error of those who reason by precedents drawn from antiquity respecting the rights of man is that they do not go far enough into antiquity. They do not go the whole way. They stop in some of the intermediate stages of 100 or 1,000 years and produce what was then done as a rule for the present day. This is no authority at all. If we travel still farther into antiquity, we shall find a direct contrary opinion and practice prevailing. And if antiquity is to be authority, 1,000 such authorities may be produced, successively contradicting each other. But if we proceed on, we shall at last come out right. We shall come to the time when man came from the hand of his Maker. What was he then? Man. Man was his high and only title, and a higher cannot be given him. But of titles I shall speak hereafter. We are now got at the origin of man, and at the origin of his rights. As to the manner in which the world has been governed from that day to this, it is no farther any concern of ours than to make a proper use of the errors or the improvements which the history of it presents. Those who lived 100 or 1,000 years ago were then moderns as we are now. They had their ancients, and those ancients had others, and we also shall be ancients in our turn. If the mere name of antiquity is to govern in the affairs of life, the people who are to live 100 or 1,000 years hence may as well take us for a precedent as we make a precedent of those who lived 100 or 1,000 years ago. The fact is that portions of antiquity, by proving everything, establish nothing. It is authority against authority all the way till we come to the divine origin of the rights of man at the creation. Here our enquiries find a resting place and our reason finds a home. If a dispute about the rights of man had arisen at the distance of 100 years from the creation, it is to this source of authority they must have referred, and it is to this same source of authority that we must now refer. Though I mean not to touch upon any sectarian principle of religion, yet it may be worth observing that the genealogy of Christ is traced to Adam. Why, then, not trace the rights of man to the creation of man? I will answer the question. Because there have been upstart governments thrusting themselves between and presumptuously working to unmake man. If any generation of men ever possessed the right of dictating the mode by which the world should be governed forever, it was the first generation that existed. And if that generation did it not, no succeeding generation can show any authority for doing it, nor can set any up. The illuminating and divine principle of the equal rights of man, for it has its origin from the Maker of man, relates not only to the living individuals, but to generations of men succeeding each other. Every generation is equal in rights to generations which preceded it by the same rule that every individual is born equal in rights with his contemporary. Every history of the creation, and every traditionary account, whether from the lettered or unlettered world, however they may vary in their opinion or belief of certain particulars, all agree in establishing one point, the unity of man, by which I mean that men are all of one degree, and consequently that all men are born equal, and with equal natural right, in the same manner as if posterity had been continued by creation instead of generation, the latter being the only mode by which the former is carried forward, and consequently every child born into the world must be considered as deriving its existence from God. The world is as new to him as it was to the first man that existed, and his natural right in it is of the same kind. The Mosaic account of the creation, whether taken as divine authority or merely historical, is full to this point, the unity or equality of man. The expression admits of no controversy. "And God said, Let us make man in our own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them." The distinction of sexes is pointed out, but no other distinction is even implied. If this be not divine authority, it is at least historical authority, and shows that the equality of man, so far from being a modern doctrine, is the oldest upon record. It is also to be observed that all the religions known in the world are founded, so far as they relate to man, on the unity of man as being all of one degree. Whether in heaven or in hell, or in whatever state man may be supposed to exist hereafter, the good and the bad are the only distinctions. Nay, even the laws of governments are obliged to slide into this principle, by making degrees to consist in crimes and not in persons. It is one of the greatest of all truths, and of the highest advantage to cultivate. By considering man in this light, and by instructing him to consider himself in this light, it places him in a close connection with all his duties, whether to his Creator or to the creation, of which he is a part, and it is only when he forgets his origin, or, to use a more fashionable phrase, his birth and family, that he becomes dissolute. It is not among the least of the evils of the present existing governments in all parts of Europe that man, considered as man, is thrown back to a vast distance from his Maker, and the artificial chasm filled up with a succession of barriers, or sort of turnpike gates, through which he has to pass. I will quote Mr. Burke's catalogue of barriers that he has set up between man and his Maker. Putting himself in the character of a herald, he says, "We fear God, we look with awe to kings, with affection to parliaments, with duty to magistrates, with reverence to priests, and with respect to nobility." Mr. Burke has forgotten to put in chivalry. He has also forgotten to put in Peter. The duty of man is not a wilderness of turnpike gates through which he is to pass by tickets from one to the other. It is plain and simple, and consists but of 2 points: his duty to God, which every man must feel, and with respect to his neighbor, to do as he would be done by. If those to whom power is delegated do well, they will be respected; if not, they will be despised, and with regard to those to whom no power is delegated, but who assume it, The rational world can know nothing of them. Hitherto we have spoken only, and that but in part, of the natural rights of man. We have now to consider the civil rights of man, and to show how the one originates from the other. Man did not enter into society to become worse than he was before, nor to have fewer rights than he had before, but to have those rights better secured. His natural rights are the foundation of all his civil rights. But in order to pursue this distinction with more precision, it will be necessary to mark the different qualities of natural and civil rights. A few words will explain this. Natural rights are those which appertain to man in right of his existence. Of this kind are all the intellectual rights, or rights of the mind, and also all those rights of acting as an individual for his own comfort and happiness, which are not injurious to the natural rights of others. Civil rights are those which appertain to man in right of his being a member of society. Every civil right has, for its foundation, some natural right pre-existing in the individual, but to the enjoyment of which his individual power is not in all cases sufficiently competent. Of this kind are all those which relate to security and protection. From this short review it will be easy to distinguish between that class of natural rights which man retains after entering into society, and those which he throws into the common stock as a member of society. The natural rights which he retains are all those in which the power to execute is as perfect in the individual as the right itself. Among this class, as is before mentioned, are all the intellectual rights, or rights of the mind. Consequently religion is one of those rights. The natural rights which are not retained are all those in which, though the right is perfect in the individual, the power to execute them is defective. They answer not his purpose. A man by natural right has a right to judge in his own cause, and so far as the right of the mind is concerned he never surrenders it. But what availeth it him to judge if he has not power to redress? He therefore deposits this right in the common stock of society, and takes the an of society, of which he is a part, in preference and in addition to his own. Society grants him nothing. Every man is a proprietor in society, and draws on the capital as a matter of right. From these premises 2 or 3 certain conclusions will follow. First, that every civil right grows out of a natural right, or in other words, is a natural right exchanged. Secondly, that civil power properly considered as such is made up of the aggregate of that class of the natural rights of man which becomes defective in the individual in point of power, and answers not his purpose, but when collected to a focus becomes competent to the purpose of everyone. Thirdly, that the power produced from the aggregate of natural rights, imperfect in power in the individual, cannot be applied to invade the natural rights which are retained in the individual, and which the power to execute is as perfect as the right itself. We have now in a few words traced man from a natural individual to a member of society, and shown, or endeavored to show, the quality of the natural rights retained, and of those which are exchanged for civil rights. Let us now apply these principles to governments. In casting our eyes over the world, it is extremely easy to distinguish the governments which have arisen out of society, or out of the social compact, from those which have not. But to place this in a clearer light than what a single glance may afford, it will be proper to take a review of the several sources from which governments have arisen and on which they have been founded. They may be all comprehended under 3 heads. First, superstition. Secondly, power. Thirdly, the common interest of society and the common rights of man. The first was a government of priestcraft, the second of conquerors, and the third of reason. When a set of artful men pretended, through the medium of oracles, to hold intercourse with the deity as familiarly as they now march up the back stairs in European courts, the world was completely under the government of superstition. The oracles were consulted, and whatever they were made to say became the law, and this sort of government lasted as long as this sort of superstition lasted. After these a race of conquerors arose, whose government, like that of William the Conqueror, was founded in power, and the sword assumed the name of a scepter. Governments thus established last as long as the power to support them lasts. But that they might avail themselves of every engine in their favor, they united fraud to force, and set up an idol, which they called divine right, and which, in imitation of the Pope, who affects to be spiritual and temporal, and in contradiction to the founder of the Christian religion, twisted itself afterwards into an idol of another shape, called Church and State. The key of St. Peter and the key of the Treasury became quartered in one another, and the wondering, cheated multitude worshipped the invention. When I contemplate the natural dignity of man, when I feel, for nature has not been kind enough to me to blunt my feelings, for the honor and happiness of its character, I become irritated at the attempt to govern mankind by force and fraud as if they were all knaves and fools, and can scarcely avoid disgust at those who are thus imposed upon. We have now to review the governments which arise out of society, in contradistinction to those which arose out of superstition and conquest. It has been thought a considerable advance towards establishing the principles of freedom, to say that government is a compact between those who govern and those who are governed. But this cannot be true, because it is putting the effect before the cause. For as man must have existed before governments existed, there necessarily was a time when governments did not exist, and consequently there could originally exist no governors to form such a compact with. The fact must be that the individuals themselves, each in his own personal and sovereign right, entered into a compact with each other to produce a government, and this is the only mode in which governments have a right to arise, and the only principle on which they have a right to exist. To possess ourselves of a clear idea of what government is, or ought to be, we must trace it to its origin. In doing this, we shall easily discover that governments must have arisen, either out of the people or over the people. Mr. Burke has made no distinction. He investigates nothing to its source, and therefore he confounds everything. But he has signified his intention of undertaking, at some future opportunity, a comparison between the Constitution of England and France. As he thus renders it a subject of controversy by throwing the gauntlet, I take him upon his own ground. It is in high challenges that high truths have the right of appearing, and I accept it with the more readiness because it affords me at the same time an opportunity of pursuing the subject with respect to governments arising out of society. But it will be first necessary to define what is meant by a constitution. It is not sufficient that we adopt the word, we must fix also a standard signification to it. A constitution is not a thing in name only, but in fact. It has not an ideal but a real existence, and wherever it cannot be produced in a visible form, there is none. A constitution is a thing antecedent to a government, and a government is only the creature of a constitution. The constitution of a country is not the act of its government, but of the people constituting its government. It is the body of elements to which you can refer and quote article by article, and which contains the principles on which the government shall be established, the manner in which it shall be organized, the powers it shall have, the mode of elections, the duration of parliaments, or by what other name such bodies may be called, the powers which the executive part of the government shall have, and in fine, everything that relates to the complete organization of a civil government, and the principles on which it shall act, and by which it shall be bound. A constitution, therefore, is to a government what the laws made afterwards by that government are to a court of judicature. The court of judicature does not make the laws, neither can it alter them. It only acts in conformity to the laws made, and the government is, in like manner, governed by the constitution. Can, then, Mr. Burke produce the English Constitution? If he cannot, we may fairly conclude that though it has been so much talked about, no such thing as a constitution exists, or ever did exist, and consequently that the people have yet a constitution to form. Mr. Burke will not, I presume, deny the position I have already advanced. Namely, that governments arise either out of the people or over the people. The English government is one of those which arose out of a conquest and not out of society, and consequently it arose over the people. And though it has been much modified from the opportunity of circumstances since the time of William the Conqueror, the country has never yet regenerated itself, and is therefore without a constitution. I readily perceive the reason why Mr. Burke declined going into the comparison between the English and French constitutions, because he could not but perceive when he sat down to the task that no such thing as a constitution existed on his side of the question. His book is certainly bulky enough to have contained all he could say on this subject, and it would have been the best manner in which people could have judged of their separate merits. Why then has he declined the only thing that was worth while to write upon? It was the strongest ground he could take if the advantages were on his side, but the weakest if they were not, and his declining to take it is either a sign that he could not possess it or could not maintain it. Mr. Burke said in a speech last winter in Parliament, quote, that when the National Assembly first met in three orders, the tiers état, the clergy, and the noblesse, France had then a good constitution. Unquote. This shows, among numerous other instances, that Mr. Burke does not understand what a constitution is. The persons so met were not a constitution, but a convention to make a constitution. The present National Assembly of France is, strictly speaking, the personal social compact. The members of it are the delegates of the nation in its original character. Future assemblies will be the delegates of the nation in its organized character. The authority of the present assembly is different from what the authority of future assemblies will be. The authority of the present one is to form a constitution. The authority of future assemblies will be to legislate according to the principles and forms prescribed in that constitution, and if experience should hereafter show that alterations, amendments, or additions are necessary, the Constitution will point out the mode by which such things shall be done, and not leave it to the discretionary power of the future government. A government on the principles on which constitutional governments arising out of society are established cannot have the right of altering itself. If it had, it would be arbitrary. It might make itself what it pleased, and wherever such a right is set up, it shows there is no constitution. The act by which the English Parliament empowered itself to sit 7 years shows there is no constitution in England. It might, by the same self-authority, have sat any great number of years, or for life. The bill which the present Mr. Pitt brought into Parliament some years ago to reform Parliament was on the same erroneous principle. The right of reform is in the nation in its original character, and the constitutional method would be by a general convention elected for the purpose. There is, moreover, a paradox in the idea of vitiated bodies reforming themselves. From these preliminaries I proceed to draw some comparisons. I have already spoken of the Declaration of Rights, and as I mean to be as concise as possible, I shall proceed to other parts of the French Constitution. The Constitution of France says that every man who pays a tax of 60 sous per annum, or 2s. 6d. in English, is an elector. What article will Mr. Burke place against this? Can anything be more limited, and at the same time more capricious, than the qualification of electors is in England? Limited, because not one man in 100, I speak much within compass, is admitted to vote. Capricious, because the lowest character that can be supposed to exist, and who has not so much as the visible means of an honest livelihood, is an elector in some places, while in other places the man who pays very large taxes, and has a known fair character, and the farmer who rents to the amount of £300 or £400 a year, with a property on that farm to 3 or 4 times that amount, is not admitted to be an elector. Everything is out of nature, as Mr. Burke says on another occasion, in this strange chaos, and all sorts of follies are blended with all sorts of crimes. William the Conqueror and his descendants parcelled out the country in this manner, and bribed some parts of it by what they call charters, to hold the other parts of it the better subjected to their will. This is the reason why so many of those charters abound in Cornwall. The people were averse to the government established at the Conquest, and the towns were garrisoned and bribed to enslave the country. All the old charters are the badges of this conquest, and it is from this source that the capriciousness of election arises. The French Constitution says that the number of representatives for any place shall be in a ratio to the number of taxable inhabitants or electors. What article will Mr. Burke place against this? The county of York, which contains nearly 1 million of souls, sends 2 county members, and so does the county of Rutland, which contains not 100th part of that number. The old town of Sarum, which contains not 3 houses, sends 2 members, and the town of Manchester, which contains upward of 60,000 souls, is not admitted to send any. Is there any principle in these things? It is admitted that all this is altered, but there is much to be done yet before we have a fair representation of the people. Is there anything by which you can trace the marks of freedom or discover those of wisdom? No wonder, then, Mr. Burke has declined the comparison, and endeavored to lead his readers from the point by a wild, unsystematical display of paradoxical rhapsodies. The French Constitution says that the National Assembly shall be elected every 2 years. What article will Mr. Burke place against this? Why, that the nation has no right at all in the case, that the government is perfectly arbitrary with respect to this point, and he can quote for his authority the precedent of a former parliament. The French Constitution says there shall be no game laws, that the farmer on whose lands wild game shall be found, for it is by the produce of his lands they are fed, shall have a right to what he can take, that there shall be no monopolies of any kind, that all trades shall be free, and every man free to follow any occupation by which he can procure an honest livelihood, and in any place, town, or city throughout the nation. What will Mr. Burke say to this? In England, game is made the property of those at whose expense it is not fed, and with respect to monopolies, the country is cut up into monopolies. Every chartered town is an aristocratical monopoly in itself, and the qualification of electors proceeds out of those chartered monopolies. Is this freedom? Is this what Mr. Burke means by a constitution? In these chartered monopolies, a man coming from another part of the country is hunted from them as if he were a foreign enemy. An Englishman is not free of his own country. Every one of those places presents a barrier in his way and tells him he is not a free man, that he has no rights. Within these monopolies are other monopolies. In a city such, for instance, as Bath, which contains between 20 and 30,000 inhabitants, the right of electing representatives to Parliament is monopolized by about 31 persons. And within these monopolies are still others. A man even of the same town, whose parents were not in circumstances to give him an occupation, is debarred in many cases from the natural right of acquiring one, be his genius or industry what it may. Are these things examples to hold out to a country regenerating itself from slavery like France? Certainly they are not, and certain am I that when the people of England come to reflect upon them, they will, like France, annihilate those badges of ancient oppression, those traces of a conquered nation. Had Mr. Burke possessed talents similar to the author of On the Wealth of Nations, he would have comprehended all the parts which enter into, and by assemblage form a constitution. He would have reasoned from minutiae to magnitude. It is not from his prejudices only, but from the disorderly cast of his genius, that he is unfitted for the subject he writes upon. Even his genius is without a constitution. It is a genius at random, and not a genius constituted. But he must say something. He is therefore mounted in the air like a balloon, to draw the eyes of the multitude from the ground they stand upon. Much is to be learned from the French Constitution. Conquest and tyranny transplanted themselves with William the Conqueror from Normandy into England, and the country is yet disfigured with the marks. May then the example of all France contribute to regenerate the freedom which a province of it destroyed. The French Constitution says that to preserve the national representation from being corrupt, no member of the National Assembly shall be an officer of the government, a placeman, or a pensioner. What will Mr. Burke place against this? I will whisper his answer: loaves and fishes. Ah, this government of loaves and fishes has more mischief in it than people have yet reflected on. The National Assembly has made the discovery, and it holds out the example to the world. Had governments agreed to quarrel on purpose to fleece their countries by taxes, they could not have succeeded better than they have done. Everything in the English government appears to me the reverse of what it ought to be, and of what it is said to be. The Parliament, imperfectly and capriciously elected as it is nevertheless supposed to hold the national purse in trust for the nation. But in the manner in which an English Parliament is constructed, it is like a man being both mortgager and mortgagee, and in the case of misapplication of trust, it is the criminal sitting in judgment upon himself. If those who vote the supplies are the same persons who receive the supplies when voted, and are to account for the expenditure of those supplies to those who voted them, it is themselves accountable to themselves, and the comedy of errors concludes with the pantomime of hush. Neither the ministerial party nor the opposition will touch upon this case. The national purse is the common hack which each mounts upon. It is like what the country people call, "ride and tie, you ride a little way, and then I." Footnote. It is a practice in some parts of the country, when two travelers have but one horse, which, like the national purse, will not carry double, that the one mounts and rides 2 or 3 miles ahead, and then ties the horse to a gate and walks on. When the second traveler arrives, he takes the horse, rides on, and passes his companion a mile or two, and ties again, and so on, ride and tie. End of footnote. They order these things better in France. The French Constitution says that the right of war and peace is in the nation. Where else should it reside but in those who are to pay the expense? In England this right is said to reside in a metaphor shown at the Tower for sixpence or a shilling apiece. So are the lions, and it would be a step nearer to reason to say it resided in them, for any inanimate metaphor is no more than a hat or a cap. We can all see the absurdity of worshipping Aaron's molten calf or Nebuchadnezzar's golden image, but why do men continue to practice themselves the absurdities they despise in others? It may with reason be said that in the manner the English nation is represented, it signifies not where the right resides, whether in the crown or in the Parliament. War is the common harvest of all those who participate in the division and expenditure of public money, in all countries. It is the art of conquering at home. The object of it is an increase of revenue. And as revenue cannot be increased without taxes, a pretense must be made for expenditure. In reviewing the history of the English government, its wars and taxes, a bystander, not blinded by prejudice nor warped by interest, would declare that taxes were not raised to carry on wars, but that wars were raised to carry on taxes. Mr. Burke, as a member of the House of Commons, is a part of the English government, and though he professes himself an enemy to war, he abuses the French Constitution, which seeks to explode it. He holds up the English government as a model in all its parts to France, but he should first know the remarks which the French make upon it. They contend in favor of their own, that the portion of liberty enjoyed in England is just enough to enslave a country more productively than by despotism, and that as the real object of all despotism is revenue, a government so formed obtains more than it could do either by direct despotism or in a full state of freedom, and is therefore, on the ground of interest, opposed to both. They account also for the readiness which always appears in such governments for engaging in wars by remarking on the different motives which produce them. In despotic governments wars are the effect of pride, but in those governments in which they become the means of taxation, they acquire thereby a more permanent promptitude. The French Constitution, therefore, to provide against both these evils, has taken away the power of declaring war from kings and ministers, and placed the right where the expense must fall. When the question of the right of war and peace was agitating in the National Assembly, the people of England appeared to be much interested in the event, and highly to applaud the decision. As a principle it applies as much to one country as another. William the Conqueror, as a conqueror, held this power of war and peace in himself, and his descendants have ever since claimed it under him as a right. Although Mr. Burke has asserted the right of the Parliament at the Revolution to bind and control the nation and posterity forever, he denies at the same time that the Parliament or the nation had any right to alter what he calls the succession of the crown in anything but in part, or by a sort of modification. By his taking this ground he throws the case back to the Norman Conquest, and by thus running a line of succession springing from William the Conqueror to the present day, he makes it necessary to inquire who and what William the Conqueror was, and where he came from, and into the origin, history, and nature of what are called prerogatives. Everything must have had a beginning, and the fog of time and antiquity should be penetrated to discover it. Let then Mr. Burke bring forward his William of Normandy, for it is to this origin that his argument goes. It also unfortunately happens, in running this line of succession, that another line parallel thereto presents itself, which is that if the succession runs in the line of the conquest, the nation runs in the line of being conquered, and it ought to rescue itself from this reproach. But it will perhaps be said that though the power of declaring war descends in the heritage of the conquest, it is held in check by the right of Parliament to withhold the supplies. It will always happen when a thing is originally wrong that amendments do not make it right, and it often happens that they do as much mischief one way as good the other, and such is the case here. For if the one rashly declares a war as a matter of right, and the other peremptorily withholds the supplies as a matter of right, the remedy becomes as bad or worse than disease. The one forces the nation to a combat, and the other ties its hands. But the more probable issue is that the contest will end in a collusion between the parties, and be made a screen to both. On this question of war, 3 things are to be considered. First, the right of declaring it. Secondly, the expense of supporting it. Thirdly, the mode of conducting it after it is declared. The French Constitution places the right where the expense must fall, and this union can only be in the nation. The mode of conducting it after it is declared it consigns to the executive department. Were this the case in all countries, we should hear but little more of wars. Before I proceed to consider other parts of the French Constitution, and by way of relieving the fatigue of argument, I will introduce an anecdote which I had from Dr. Franklin. While the doctor resided in France as minister from America during the war, he had numerous proposals made to him by projectors of every country and of every kind, who wished to go to the land that floweth with milk and honey, America, and among the rest there was one who offered himself to be king. He introduced his proposal to the doctor by letter, which is now in the hands of M. Beaumarchais of Paris, stating first that as the Americans had dismissed or sent away their king, that they would want another. Footnote. The word he used was renvoyer, dismissed or sent away. End of footnote. Secondly, that himself was a Norman. Thirdly, that he was of a more ancient family than the Dukes of Normandy, and of a more honorable descent, his line having never been bastardized. Fourthly, that there was already a precedent in England of kings coming out of Normandy, and on these grounds he rested his offer, enjoining that the doctor would forward it to America. But as the doctor neither did this, nor yet sent him an answer, the projector wrote a second letter, in which he did not, it is true, threaten to go over and conquer America, but only with great dignity proposed that if his offer was not accepted, an acknowledgment of about 30,000 livres might be made to him for his generosity. Now as all arguments respecting secession must necessarily connect that succession with some beginning, Mr. Burke's arguments on this subject go to show that there is no English origin of kings, and that they are descendants of the Norman line in right of the conquest. It may therefore be of service to his doctrine to make this story known, and to inform him that in case of that natural extinction to which all mortality is subject, kings may again be had from Normandy on more reasonable terms than William the Conqueror, and consequently that the good people of England at the Revolution of 1688 might have done much better had such a generous Norman as this known their wants and they had known his. The chivalric character which Mr. Burke so much admires is certainly much easier to make a bargain with than a hard-dealing Dutchman. But to return to the matters of the Constitution. The French Constitution says there shall be no titles, and of consequence all that class of equivocal generation which in some countries is called aristocracy, and in others nobility, is done away, and the peer is exalted into the man. Titles are but nicknames, and every nickname is a title. The thing is perfectly harmless in itself, but it marks a sort of foppery in the human character which degrades it. It reduces man into the diminutive of man in things which are great, and the counterfeit of women in things which are little. It talks about its fine blue ribbon like a girl, and shows its new garter like a child. A certain writer of some antiquity says, "When I was a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things." It is properly from the elevated mind of France that the folly of titles has fallen. It has outgrown the baby clothes of count and duke, and breeched itself in manhood. France has not levelled, it has exalted. It has put down the dwarf to set up the man. The punyism of a senseless word like duke, count, or earl has ceased to please. Even those who possess them have disowned the gibberish, and as they outgrew the rickets have despised the rattle. The genuine mind of man, thirsting for its native home, society, contemns the gewgaws that separate him from it. Titles are like circles drawn by the magician's wand to contract the sphere of man's felicity. He lives immured within the bastille of a word, and surveys at a distance the envied life of man. Is it then any wonder that titles should fall in France? Is it not a greater wonder that they should be kept up anywhere? What are they? What is their worth, and what is their amount? When we think or speak of a judge or a general, we associate with it the ideas of office and character. We think of gravity in one, and bravery in the other. But when we use the word merely as a title, no ideas associate with it. Through all the vocabulary of Adam, there is not such an animal as a duke or a count, neither can we connect any certain ideas with the words. Whether they mean strength or weakness, wisdom or folly, a child or a man, or the rider or the horse, is all equivocal. What respect, then, can be paid to that which describes nothing, and which means nothing? Imagination has given figure and character to centaurs, satyrs, and down to all the fairy tribe, but titles baffle even the powers of fancy, and are a chimerical nondescript. But this is not all. If a whole country is disposed to hold them in contempt, and all their value is gone, and none will own them, it is common opinion only that makes them anything, or nothing, or worse than nothing. There is no occasion to take titles away, for they take themselves away when society concurs to ridicule them. This species of imaginary consequence has visibly declined in every part of Europe, and it hastens to its exit as the world of reason continues to rise. There was a time when the lowest class of what are called nobility was more thought of than the highest is now, and when a man in armor riding through Christendom in quest of adventures was more stared at than a modern duke. The world has seen this folly fall, and it has fallen by being laughed at, and the farce of titles will follow its fate. The patriots of France have discovered in good time that rank and dignity in society must take a new ground. The old one has fallen through. It must now take the substantial ground of character instead of the chimerical ground of titles, and they have brought their titles to the altar and made of them a burnt offering to reason. If no mischief had annexed itself to the folly of titles, they would not have been worth a serious and formal destruction, such as the National Assembly have decreed them. And this makes it necessary to inquire farther into the nature and character of aristocracy. That, then, which is called aristocracy in some countries, and nobility in others, arose out of the governments founded upon conquest. It was originally a military order for the purpose of supporting military government, for such were all governments founded in conquest, and to keep up a succession of this order for the purpose for which it was established. All the younger branches of those families were disinherited, and the law of primogenitorship set up. The nature and character of aristocracy shows itself to us in this law. It is the law against every other law of nature, and nature herself calls for its destruction. Establish family justice, and aristocracy falls. By the aristocratical law of primogenitorship, in a family of 6 children, 5 are exposed. Aristocracy has never more than 1 child. The rest are begotten to be devoured. They are thrown to the cannibal for prey, and the natural parent prepares the unnatural repast. As everything which is out of nature in man affects more or less the interest of society, so does this. All the children which the aristocracy disowns, which are all except the eldest, are in general cast like orphans on a parish, to be provided for by the public, but at a greater charge. Unnecessary offices and places in government and courts are created at the expense of the public to maintain them. With what kind of parental reflections can the father or mother contemplate their younger offspring? By nature they are children, and by marriage they are heirs, but by aristocracy they are bastards and orphans. They are the flesh and blood of their parents in the one line, and nothing akin to them in the other. To restore, therefore, parents to their children, and children to their parents, relations to each other, and man to society, and to exterminate the monster aristocracy, root and branch, the French Constitution has destroyed the law of primogenitorship. Here, then, lies the monster, and Mr. Burke, if he pleases, may write its epitaph. Hitherto we have considered aristocracy chiefly in one point of view. We have now to consider it in another. But whether we view it before or behind, or sideways or any way else, domestically or publicly, it is still a monster. In France aristocracy had one feature less in its countenance than what it has in some other countries. It did not compose a body of hereditary legislators. It was not a corporation of aristocracy, for such I have heard M. de Lafayette describe an English House of Peers. Let us then examine the grounds upon which the French Constitution has resolved against having such a house in France. Because, in the first place, as is already mentioned, aristocracy is kept up by family tyranny and injustice. Secondly, because there is an unnatural unfitness in an aristocracy to be legislators for a nation. Their ideas of distributive justice are corrupted at the very source. They begin life by trampling on all their younger brothers and sisters and relations of every kind, and are taught and educated so to do. With what ideas of justice or honor can that man enter a house of legislation, who absorbs in his own person the inheritance of a whole family of children, or doles out to them some pitiful portion with the insolence of a gift. Thirdly, because the idea of hereditary legislators is as inconsistent as that of hereditary judges or hereditary juries, and as absurd as an hereditary mathematician or hereditary wise man, and as ridiculous as a hereditary poet laureate. Fourthly, because a body of men holding themselves accountable to nobody ought not to be trusted by anybody. Fifthly, because it is continuing the uncivilized principle of governments founded in conquest, and the base idea of man having property in man, and governing him by personal right. Sixthly, because aristocracy has a tendency to deteriorate the human species. By the universal economy of nature it is known, and by the instance of the Jews it is proved, that the human species has a tendency to degenerate in any small number of persons when separated from the general stock of society, and intermarrying constantly with each other. It defeats even its pretended end, and becomes in time the opposite of what is noble in man. Mr. Burke talks of nobility. Let him show what it is. The greatest characters the world have known have arisen on the democratic floor. Aristocracy has not been able to keep a proportionate pace with democracy. The artificial noble shrinks into a dwarf before the noble of nature, and in the few instances of those, for there are some in all countries, in whom nature as by a miracle has survived an aristocracy, those men despise it. But it is time to proceed to a new subject. The French Constitution has reformed the condition of the clergy. It has raised the income of the lower and middle classes, and taken from the higher. None are now less than 1,200 livres £50 sterling, nor any higher than £2,000 or £3,000. What will Mr. Burke place against this? Hear what he says. He says, quote, that the people of England can see, without pain or grudging, an archbishop precede a duke. They can see a bishop of Durham or a bishop of Winchester in possession of £10,000 a year, and cannot see why it is in worse hands than estates to a like amount in the hands of this earl or that squire. Unquote. And Mr. Burke offers this as an example to France. As to the first part, whether the archbishop precedes the duke or the duke the bishop, it is, I believe, to the people in general, somewhat like Sternhold and Hopkins, or Hopkins and Sternhold. You may put which you pleased first, and as I confess that I do not understand the merits of the case, I will not contest it with Mr. Burke. But with respect to the latter I have something to say. Mr. Burke has not put the case right. The comparison is out of order, by being put between the bishop and the earl or the squire. It ought to be put between the bishop and the curate. And then it will stand thus, quote, the people of England can see, without pain or grudging, a bishop of Durham or a bishop of Winchester in possession of £10,000 a year, and a curate on £30 or £40 a year or less. Unquote. No, sir, they certainly do not see those things without great pain or grudging. It is a case that applies itself to every man's sense of justice, and is one among many that calls aloud for a constitution. In France the cry of the Church, was repeated as often as in Mr. Burke's book, and as loudly as when the Dissenters' Bill was before the English Parliament. But the generality of the French clergy were not to be deceived by this cry any longer. They knew that whatever the pretence might be, it was they who were one of the principal objects of it. It was the cry of the high beneficed clergy to prevent any regulation of income taking place between those of £10,000 a year and the parish priest. They therefore joined their case to those of every other oppressed class of men, and by this union obtained redress. The French Constitution has abolished tithes, that source of perpetual discontent between the tithe holder and the parishioner. When land is held on tithe, it is in the condition of an estate held between two parties, the one receiving 1/10 and the other 9/10 of the produce, and consequently, on principles of equity, if the estate can be improved, and made to produce by that improvement double or treble what it did before, or in any other ratio, the expense of such improvement ought to be borne in like proportion between the parties who are to share the produce. But this is not the case in tithes. The farmer bears the whole expense, and the tithe holder takes 1/10 of the improvement in addition to the original 10, and by this means gets the value of 2/10 instead of 1. This is another case that calls for a constitution. The French Constitution hath abolished or renounced toleration and intolerance also, and hath established universal right of conscience. Toleration is not the opposite of intolerance, but is the counterfeit of it. Both are despotisms. The one assumes to itself the right of withholding liberty of conscience, and the other of granting it. The one is the Pope armed with fire and faggot, and the other is the Pope selling or granting indulgences. The former is church and state, and the latter is church and traffic. But toleration may be viewed in a much stronger light. Man worships not himself but his Maker, and the liberty of conscience which he claims is not for the service of himself but of his God. In this case, therefore, we must necessarily have the associated idea of two things: the mortal who renders the worship, and the immortal being who is worshipped. Toleration, therefore, places itself not between man, nor between church and church, nor between one denomination of religion and another, but between God and man, between the being who worships and the being who is worshipped, and by the same act of assumed authority which it tolerates man to pay his worship, it presumptuously and blasphemously sets itself up to tolerate the Almighty to receive it. Were a bill brought into any Parliament entitled, "An Act to tolerate or grant liberty to the Almighty to receive the worship of a Jew or Turk," or "to prohibit the Almighty from receiving it," all men would startle and call it blasphemy. There would be an uproar. The presumption of tolerance in religious matters would then present itself unmasked, but the presumption is not the less because the name of man only appears to those laws, for the associated idea of the worshipper and the worshipped cannot be separated. Who then art thou, vain dust and ashes, by whatever name thou art called, whether a king, a bishop, a church or a state, a parliament, or anything else, that obtrudest thine insignificance between the soul of man and its Maker? Mind thine own concerns. If he believes not as thou believest, it is a proof that thou believest not as he believes, and there is no earthly power that can determine between you. With respect to what are called denominations of religion, if every one is left to judge of its own religion, there is no such thing as a religion that is wrong. But if they are to judge of each other's religion, there is no such thing as a religion that is right, and therefore all the world is right, or all the world is wrong. But with respect to religion itself, without regard to names, and as directing itself from the universal family of mankind to the divine object of all adoration, it is man bringing to his Maker the fruits of his heart, and though those fruits may differ from each other like the fruits of the earth, the grateful tribute of every one is accepted. A bishop of Durham or a bishop of Winchester, or the archbishop who heads the dukes, will not refuse a tithe sheaf of wheat because it is not a cock of hay, nor a cock of hay because it is not a sheaf of wheat, nor a pig because it is neither one nor the other. But these same persons, under the figure of an established church, will not permit their Maker to receive the varied tithes of man's devotion. One of the continual choruses of Mr. Burke's book is church and state. He does not mean some one particular church or some one particular state, but any church and state, and he uses the term as a general figure to hold forth the political doctrine of always uniting the church with the state in every country, and he censures the National Assembly for not having done this in France. Let us bestow a few thoughts on this subject. All religions are in their nature kind and benign and united with principles of morality. They could not have made proselytes at first by professing anything that was vicious, cruel, persecuting, or immoral. Like everything else, they had their beginning, and they proceeded by persuasion, exhortation, and example. How then is it that they lose their native mildness and become morose and intolerant? It proceeds from the connection which Mr. Burke recommends. By engendering the church with the state, a sort of mule animal, capable only of destroying and not of breeding up, is produced, called the church established by law. It is a stranger, even from its birth, to any parent mother on whom it is begotten, and whom in time it kicks out and destroys. The Inquisition in Spain does not proceed from the religion originally professed, but from this mule animal engendered between the church and the state. The burnings in Smithfield proceeded from the same heterogeneous production, and it was the regeneration of this strange animal in England afterwards that renewed rancor and irreligion among the inhabitants, and that drove the people called Quakers and Dissenters to America. Persecution is not an original feature in any religion, but it is always the strongly marked feature of all law religions, or religions established by law. take away the law establishment, and every religion reassumes its original benignity. In America, a Catholic priest is a good citizen, a good character, and a good neighbor. An Episcopalian minister is of the same description, and this proceeds independently of the men from there being no law establishment in America. If also we view this matter in a temporal sense, we shall see the ill effects it has had on the prosperity of nations. The union of church and state has impoverished Spain. The revoking of the Edict of Nantes drove the silk manufacture from that country into England, and church and state are now driving the cotton manufacture from England to America and France. Let then Mr. Burke continue to preach his anti-political doctrine of church and state. It will do some good. The National Assembly will not follow his advice, but will benefit by his folly. It was by observing the ill effects of it in England that America has been warned against it, and it is by experiencing them in France that the National Assembly have abolished it, and, like America, have established universal right of conscience and universal right of citizenship. Footnote: when in any country we see extraordinary circumstances taking place, they naturally lead any man who has a talent for observation and investigation to inquire into the causes. The manufacturers of Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield are the principal manufacturers in England. From whence did this arise? A little observation will explain the case. The principal and the generality of the inhabitants of those places are not of what is called in England the church established by law, and they or their fathers, for it is within but a few years, withdrew from the persecution of the chartered towns, where test laws more particularly operate, and established a sort of asylum for themselves in those places. It was the only asylum that then offered, for the rest of Europe was worse. But the case is now changing. France and America bid all comers welcome, and initiate them into all the rights of citizenship. Policy and interest, therefore, will, but perhaps too late, dictate in England what reason and justice could not. Those manufacturers are withdrawing and arising in other places. There is now erecting in Passy, 3 miles from Paris, a large cotton manufactory, and several are already erected in America. Soon after the rejecting the bill for repealing the test law, one of the richest manufacturers in England said in my hearing, quote, "England, sir, is not a country for a dissenter to live in. We must go to France." Unquote. These are truths, and it is doing justice to both parties to tell them. It is chiefly the dissenters that have carried English manufactures to the height they are now at, and the same men have it in their power to carry them away. And though those manufactures would afterwards continue in those places, the foreign market will be lost. There frequently appear in the London Gazette extracts from certain acts to prevent machines and persons, as far as they can extend to persons, from going out of the country. It appears from these that the ill effects of the test laws and church establishment begin to be much suspected, but the remedy of force can never supply the remedy of reason. In the progress of less than a century, all the unrepresented part of England of all denominations, which is at least 100 times the most numerous, may begin to feel the necessity of a constitution, and then all those matters will come regularly before them. End of footnote. End of section 30. Recording by Colleen McMahon.